I warmly welcome you in the name of Civil 7 to today's event, holding the G7 Accountable, the Progress Report 2022 and Mechanisms of Accountability from a Gender Perspective. My name is Sophie Knabner and I'm one of the coordinators of Civil 7, and I am happy to facilitate this session today. And our topic is accountability in the context of G7. Why talking about that? G7 is an informal forum whose implementation depends largely on the state holding the presidency. And G7's declarations are not legally binding, and there are no legal forms of accountability. And that informal nature makes it challenging to monitor G7 states' performance and to hold the leaders accountable in fulfilling their commitments. And that goes for the public and the civil society. So our aim today is to understand and to critically reflect on mechanisms of accountability in the context of G7. What we can't do today is to discuss the results of the progress report in detail. We have already shared the link. You can find the report online, and we already shared it via our newsletter. And if you had a look, it's quite comprehensive. So that goes beyond our possibilities today. But we will have a closer look, of course, at gender accountability mechanisms and this year's results regarding gender and equality. And I'm happy to welcome our speakers today, Dr. Timo Behrens, the head of the Accountability Working Group at German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. The working group is responsible for the Elmau Progress Report, and Timo Behrens will give us insights on the making, the process, and the methodology behind the report. I also warmly welcome Pam Rajput. Professor Rajput is one of 60 Women 7 advisors who formulated the joint demands and recommendations, which constitute the W7 communiqué. Maybe a few words on the engagement groups, the G7 engagement groups, for those who are not so familiar with it. There are in total 7 engagement groups who follow the G7 negotiations and processes, and who organize their own summits and bring in their recommendations to the G7 leaders. And one of them is Civil 7, organizing the session today, and Women 7. And Pam Rajput co-chairs the working group on accountability mechanisms, and she will speak about the importance of accountability mechanisms, and in particular those that measure progress on gender. And she will critically reflect on some findings regarding equality in this year's report. If we take a brief look at our program, we will start with the input from Timo Behrens, and then we have time for questions, and then Pam Rajput will follow, and here we also have time for Q&A, and then we open the floor to a plenary discussion. And then I would like to hand over to Timo Behrens. Maybe we need a minute to share the next presentation.
I'll try to fill that minute. Thank you, Sophie. First of all, with a thank you to you and the team for having me here today in this round of C7. And as we said, we're not discussing the results today too much, but maybe I can use this moment for a little advertisement box. So on Monday, I think most of you or all of you have probably also received the invitation. I have definitely seen a few names in the room also on our participant list. On Monday next week, we have the presentation and the, let's say, launch of the report, or the launch event. I mean, the report has been out since June, but let's say a moment to look at some details as well from the MZ side, both in Berlin and virtually. On behalf of the G7 presidency this year. And no one of you has seen this yet, but this is how the report looks So indeed, it is rather comprehensive, 300 pages printed, and whoever wants a print, if you're in presence in the room, you can pick it up there. Otherwise, we've tried to save paper, but we do have enough copies, I think, let's say for a while. So enough of the filler. That's my presentation that has been pulled up. So thank you very much for that. So what I will present to you is, let's say, the process on how the Accountability Working Group let's say, produces this report, what is behind it, how is the process, in terms of what kind of mechanisms do we have to ensure accountability. And I hope to convince you that, let's say, this is not just a piece of paper where the G7 celebrates how great they are and what kind of, let's say, initiatives they have started, but that is actually accountability in the sense that we do have a good process and methodology to actually self-critically look at the progress that the G7 have achieved, which means sometimes it is good and sometimes it's not as good as we would like. So this is the main point for today. I think there's also quite a lot of colleagues from Japan in the room. So I'm sure you will also be interested in how this works next year. It's a little bit different, but let me show you this in detail. So a little bit of background on the Accountability Working Group and the report. So the Accountability Working Group is not as old as the G7 themselves. It has existed now since 2009. In the Italian presidency of 2009 is when the Accountability Working Group was created. And the first comprehensive accountability report, so a similar format as the one you will find from this year's presidency, was published in 2010 in Muskoka. So this is now the fifth report, as these comprehensive accountability reports only get published every 3 years. So it's not an annual publication, it's a triennial publication. And we are now in the fifth installment since 2010. The Accountability Working Group, that might be important for those that are a little bit more into the details on how the G7 operate. It reports on the development and development-related commitments of the G7, which means of the leaders of the G7. So what we are talking about is always commitments made in the leaders track. So by the heads of state and government of G7 at the summits. It is not about the commitments that you will find in the ministerial publications and ministerial communiques, for example, from the development communique, which obviously at times will have a large overlap with the leaders track, but it's not the same. So we are part of the leaders track and we report to the Sherpa structure. So this year, the G7 Accountability Working Group is with the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, one of the very few dedicated development ministries that are still there in the G7. So in other years, you will probably find this in the foreign offices, but it's neither part of the foreign nor the development track, it is part of the leaders track. The goals are primarily the monitoring and reporting on progress towards, as I said, the development and development-related G7 leaders commitments. And the, let's say, the goal of this reporting, because we're not doing this because it's a nice and comprehensive process, it is there to also increase our capacity, which means the G7 capacity to meet our commitments. So in the report, if you didn't have a chance to look at it yet, you will find about 4 pages in the comprehensive reports that make an assessment on how we have progressed, but there's also information in there what factors have hindered our progress and where we need to get better and what we could, let's say, adjust or where we need adjustments. So this is meant by increase our capacity. So an analytical overview of the progress and why we are where we are. The primary target are the G7 leaders. So the audience are 8 people. But obviously, beyond, let's say, this primary group, I think most people that are interested in this, definitely in numbers, are you, civil society. So this is definitely a report that is also written for you and the general public in the G7 members, but also in our partner countries, because a lot of the development commitments obviously affect and are directed at partner countries and people in partner countries. So we also want to be held accountable by you and by our partners in the countries where we actually do our development work. So this is, let's say, the audience and the goals that we have with the report. The accountability reports, as I said, are published every 3 years. So the comprehensive ones, if you look for the last one, you will find the one from the French presidency in 2019. And important is that in the years in between, what you will find are more focused reports. So they are either focused on a particular theme, on an issue, on a topic, or they are focused on a sector. So, for example, last year's report by the colleagues from Britain is on health. So it has a strong focus on the health commitments. The commitments are always the same. So they are reporting on the same commitments that are also monitored and reported in the comprehensive accountability report, but it's like a subset, a sample that they pick, and there's much more in-depth information. So it's not the 4 pages per commitment that I've mentioned before, but it's really a long, in-depth analysis on where do we stand with regard to a subset of commitments. If I say prepared by the French colleagues, the German colleagues, or the British colleagues, this is something might be a little bit colloquial in the sense that this is prepared by all G7 members. So the presidencies facilitate this process. They do a lot of the editorial work, the preparation of drafts, but these are always texts that are consensuated within the G7. So this is what I will show you a little bit more in depth on the next slide, how this actually works, by just going through the timeline of the accountability process in this year. As you can see, we're already pretty advanced. We have a 5-step process, and 4 of those we have already completed. I'm not going to bore you, let's say, by going through our meetings with you one by one, but just so that you can see the progression throughout the year and what still remains to be done, so that you can see how each individual step works. So the accountability working group this year has met relatively early in January. And this first meeting is usually there to outline the work program for the year. If you are new to G7, same, or well, not the same, but similar also in G20, both formats are not very formalized. They don't have a secretariat or a formalized structure. So at the beginning of the year, it is very important that the working groups come together, define their work program, and the presidency also comes to an agreement with the other G7 members on how to proceed. So this first meeting was mainly on this. What do we want to do? What is our time frame? Until when do we want to do, or do we need what kind of inputs from you? And then you review the methodology. The methodology of the progress report is something that is not reinvented every year. It is a methodology that is fixed, that can have some minor adjustments. So if you had a chance to look at the document, what you will find is indicators on each commitment. And sometimes the indicators get outdated because there's a better database available now, or because what you were measuring doesn't apply anymore because maybe your deadline was already past year, so you need to update this unto current circumstances. So all of these kind of, let's say, decisions are being made before we start talking about any kind of content. So it's always, for us, methodology first this year, and then content at the end. The same goes for sunsetting. Sunsetting is a specific term that we will still work on until October. Sunsetting means that every 3 years, when the comprehensive accountability report gets published, the G7 also decide where reporting ends. The reporting always ends after the report has been published. So a lot of commitments that you will find in this year's report will not be reported anymore in 3 years' time. But this will only happen after, let's say, a final report has been published. So the decision for sunsetting comes after the report has been published. So there's no, let's say, possibility to not report on anything because you don't like the results for one reason or another. The reporting will always happen, and then afterwards you can sunset it. Sunsetting happens usually, well, there's terms of reference why sunsetting happens, and the main criteria is always after 6 years, you sunset commitments. So they get reported 6 years after the commitment was made. And then there's a few exceptions to this rule. For example, if it is commitment that lasts longer than 6 years, obviously you keep reporting. If the goals haven't been reached, you keep reporting. And if there is overarching, let's say, political reasons and a decision by our leaders to keep reporting, then the reporting also continues. And then we actually started to discuss the first set of draft texts. The next 2 points, I think, or the next 2 sessions, I can present a little bit more quickly. So what we did in the second and the third session is basically discuss these through 300 pages of reporting text, which means that the presidency, with assistance from colleagues, in this case from DEA, which is now IDOS, is preparing the drafts, sends them around, and then colleagues from the G7 comment on them, and we come to an agreement in these sessions. That is a very quick representation of a process that is very complex, because there's 2 ways that we collect this data. One is from databases, mainly OECD databases. So OECD DAC, for example, is the easiest one, where we can just draw down data on our progress. But in a lot of cases, this is not possible because the data we are measuring does not have a database that is sufficiently precise for our needs. So in this case, we actually ask colleagues in the ministries of every G7 country to provide this data, say, handmade or manufactured for us, which means that we probably employed a few hundred people throughout all G7 and our colleagues in the ministries to provide this data for us. So there's a lot of work that goes into that to collect these texts, and then we provide, let's say, the drafts as a presidency and go through them. So in these 2 sessions, we come up at the end with a decision on a final draft of the text, which we then send to Sherpas to have final clearance, let's say, and then submit the report to the G7 leaders. We hoped this year to be able to launch this, let's say, slightly before the summit. This is also for the German colleagues that have already been in the call in April. What we announced as our goal, so that you have time to review it before the summit. But as you can tell, the timeline for half a year, and we also said this in the last meeting, is so tight that we only managed to publish it at the summit as an annex of the summit document. It's just unfortunately a little bit too tight, but I hope we can have this discussion then on Monday on the results. So the launch event, which is mentioned here, is the one on Monday. And what is still about to happen in October is the final decision on the sunsetting that we had already started in January. So after the document is now published and after the summit, we now have the results of the new commitments in, which means we can now decide what kind of commitments get updated, let's say, which means the old commitments are not reported in anymore. Other commitments in the same field may come in, or where we end the monitoring and reporting for certain reporting lines because they're older than 6 years and have ideally been met, or where there's no new political, let's say, impulse to continue this, just to keep this a fresh and updated document, because otherwise you're going to have a 600-page document, which I don't think anybody will read. So let's move on to, I think, my final slide of content. But I have, in fact, already told you, I think, 90% of what is in here by going through the process of this year. So please allow me to just check if I forgot anything important. So this is when we share the document later, you also have this maybe as a reminder of how we work. So this is what I just said, just drawn up by, say, work lines and not by specific dates. This might be interesting. Last point from my side, how do new commitments get included? This is what we are actually working on right now. So new commitments get included in the monitoring and reporting in the following way. The accountability working group analyzes the summit declaration, the summit communique by the leaders and its annexes. and then tries to identify which are the most important development or development-related commitment of this year that can have indicators, like something that is in any way measurable. So it has to also be, let's say, functional. We have to be able to come up with indicators to measure this. The top 3 or 4 of those will be presented to the other G7 members in the accountability working group. We receive feedback on it, which is the moment where we are currently at. So I still have to look through and systematize the feedback, but we've just received the feedback from our partners. And then if there's an agreement on the topics we want to measure, we will develop a proposal for the indicators on how we measure our success. And once this is agreed upon, this also stands. So in 3 years' time, this is the indicators that we will be reporting on, no matter, let's say, if the results are favorable or unfavorable in terms of progress. So we have predefined indicators on measures of success in the year that the commitment was made. Yeah, that is pretty much it. There's a lot more to say, but not a lot more time. So I leave the rest for the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Yes, hello. Thank you for taking my question. So I'm actually interested, of course, to hear which items have been discussed for monitoring and reporting in the upcoming progress report. We, of course, have a couple of items already in mind from the past communiques, and I mean, I assume that you do not only monitor the one from this year, but also from the previous 2 years at least, I think, since the last progress report was published. Maybe you can elaborate on that. And also, I would like to ask if you said that only items can be included in the progress report that are measurable. And we've actually been looking at the report, at the communique, and have seen that several of the items there are not very measurable and very vague, and can therefore are very difficult to be monitored. Therefore, so. Yeah, how does this fit together? Is this on purpose? It feels a little bit because I think some of the items that are in there deserve to be mentioned again and followed up on, even though they are not very measurable in itself. But I believe that that there could be a process to find out how to measure these items also after the summit. Yeah, thanks. Sorry for the long explanations.
Thanks. It's the obvious question, which ones? I can't be unfair to my colleagues and review this yet, because obviously these are ongoing discussions. So this is a little bit difficult. Let me start with the easy part, which is the technical question associated to that. We will keep reporting on commitments that were made before this year, as we have reported now as well. So this is what I meant when I said 6 years is usually the deadline. So anything that happened between the next report and 6 years previously is continuously reported. So the only thing that happens is we are not including, let's say, commitments from 2021 in the exercise of 2022. So let's say the decision on what we include from Carbis Bay have already been made, and they're already in the report. So we are only this year deciding what do we include from this year. And next year, the Japanese colleagues will make a proposal on what to include from their presidency to the accountability working group. And this is like how this works. I hope that's clear. If not, call me up, or maybe if it's quick, I can try to clarify once more. In general terms, like ongoing discussions are always difficult to comment on, because I really need to respect, let's say, the debates that we have with the colleagues. But what we want to do, and I think that is okay to say, what we're thinking about in terms of issue areas is to represent the main development-oriented pillars. And what we see as those, we meaning BMZ in this case, as leading this group, and what we've proposed as areas, let's say, is climate change or the whole climate area. Then I think that is something you will probably like, food security and nutrition. And then another one, which is just transition. So climate, food security, nutrition, just transition. I think at that level, that is not surprising to anyone because those are what we think are the main pillars there. And I hope it's okay that I don't go into more detail what particular sentences or items we want to measure, because I cannot indirectly commit our partners to something that they haven't yet agreed on. So, this I would leave it there. And then, big smile on my face, measurability of the commitments. Unfortunately, the Accountability Working Group doesn't get asked before the sentences are formulated at the leaders' communique, and understandably so, because they are political commitments, and the weighing of how those texts are formulated is a very dynamic and intense political process. So we, unfortunately, from a technical point of view, have to make the best out of what we get. Sometimes it's easy if it says, just making something up here, ODA flows to topic X will increase by Y%, then yes, great, awesome. We can put this in. Or for example, last year, the commitment on sharing of vaccine doses, for example, there's a clear number and a clear time frame, and that is the easy part. Not so easy if, and I guess that's what you have identified, if we have commitments that don't have this direct relations. We will then, in the Accountability Working Group, translate this into proxies, like into something that we think is close to the political language to measure this progress. If we can have it in a quantitative base, let's say the baseline that we will never drop under is self-reporting. So if we have something where we cannot identify this, we will still have the text inside, and then we will go, this is what I explained before, to our G7 colleagues in the presidencies that are, in the countries, in the ministries that are responsible for implementing whatever was agreed on, and they will write a narrative report. And we will receive this narrative report as the presidency, or then our future colleagues will receive the narrative report. And then we will try to make a comprehensive text out of this. This is much more work. So we always prefer to go for quantitative data or any kind of database. But let's say if it is not at all possible, this is always the fallback option. So narrative reporting by all the individual members.
Thank you very much. One question was also, which would the new commitments be? And thank you very much for pointing out the directions. That sounds interesting. Of course, we would have liked to see feminist development and foreign policy in that as well. And also in this slide, I would like to ask, you mentioned, I think, that there is also the possibility to adapt what is being measured, because my very concrete question is there a possibility of having more gender sensible indicators with sex disaggregated data, for example? Because if the G7 are really serious about working in the spirit of feminist foreign trade and development policy, this commitments like food security or climate change also needs to be measured by and disaggregated by gender. And right now, this is not the case. So my question would be, is that something that you're looking at or taken into consideration?
Thank you, Mr. Behrens, for all that reports and your insights. My question is on the indicators. If I got you correctly, you said the process for developing the indicators is about in the next 3 years. Maybe I got it wrong. And referring to that question, I would like to ask if there is a possibility for civil society organizations to feed in somehow in that process. And as you said, unfortunately, the report came out quite late, just at the summit of Elmau. Totally understand the reasons for that, but in an ideal world, and I think we said it also in earlier exchanges, we would have loved to feed in the draft of the report beforehand, but I understand it's very difficult. But maybe just your thoughts, how you see maybe for the next time this could be considered, that there's some kind of consultation from the society for draft version. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think you would find a lot of agreement within the ministry, also on feminist development policy, on how do we gender disaggregate indicators, like what do we do with this. The technical part, again, first, the indicators are defined in the year that the commitment is made and the let's say the item is moved into reporting and monitoring. So if we update the indicators, we are very restrictive in doing so, because and I think Fiona, I'm Timo, by the way, I'm better with first names. When we update the indicators, the issue, or why we are so reluctant to do this, is in a normal situation, they're reported on twice. So you have a commitment, and then the first time it is reported on is 3 years down the line, and the second time it is reported on is 6 years down the line, unless they end up, for coincidence or for political focus, let's say, in one of the thematic or sectoral reports. But let's say the default that you have to calculate is there's 2 reporting moments, after 3 and after 6 years. If we change the indicators from one report to the next, you will not have any kind of comparability between the 2 reports. So it is like a trade-off. If you want to continuously report, or do you want to update your indicators while you do it? And usually, that at least was the line of the German presidency and the accountability working group in this year, we have tried to achieve consistency of data, which means we try to use the same databases with the same indicators and the same numbers from the last reports, so that you can have a comparison between the past and the present. It's not always the case, and sometimes it doesn't make sense. So in those moments, like where it is technically nonsensical, let's say, to use a database that doesn't reflect what you need anymore, then we update it. But we only do it if we have to, because you lose this consistency between 2 different data points. It's a trade-off. Like, I don't think there's, but I do think there's a better and a worse decision. But I mean, that is our opinion, or my personal opinion as well. But you could obviously decide this also in the other direction. So it's an evaluation question. But this is how we've done this year. The indicators are not developed over 3 years. I hope that this also became clear what I meant with 3 years. They are developed now. We will decide on them hopefully in October. And then in 3 years, they will be used for the reporting. So this is what I meant. Like, we decide on them at the moment of the commitment, because now we also, if we would have questions on how to interpret parts of the commitment, it was just made. So the same people, the same political actors, and the same context is still in place. So if we need clarification, we can now go back. If we go back in 3 years and try to clarify what was meant by a commitment, things change. And then we don't know if this is actually what was in the text, which highlights another point, which I think is also part of the answer to this set of questions. We are not very free to define the indicators in the sense that we need to stay very close to the language of the leaders text. So if the leaders text does not specify any kind of gender disaggregate focus, or a regional focus, let's say, but we think from a development perspective, Latin America, Asia, or Africa, or Eastern Europe should be the focus, then we are not free to just decide to do that. Like, we need to monitor what they have actually agreed upon. So we're usually a little bit restrictive as well in that sense. that we really try to mirror the leaders' language as good as possible and not go beyond it, but also not fall short of what was decided. We do also have a lot of times, and you will know this from your own work, trouble to find quality gender disaggregated data. It is just really hard to find. But if we can, and if the commitment requires it or allows it, I would say, because there is a strong inclination to do this. Like this is something that we look at. Like, is there any way to report on this in a gender disaggregate way? Like, does the text allow it? And let's say, is there a database? I think if that happens, if we can identify that, we would also use that. So if you don't find it, it's either old. So the decision was already made 6 years ago, and we're reluctant to change this, for example. Or we just did not find a database that was good enough. What we currently work with, for example, where we would need gender disaggregated data, and that should be in the footnote somewhere also in the report, is there's a footnote that will say as soon as gender disaggregated data becomes available, we put it in, and we just don't have it yet. So I think this is something that we do have an eye on. Last point, civil society and feeding into the reporting process and the decision, or let's say the development of indicators. I've also said that we would also have liked to publish it a bit earlier. Usually the G7 summits are later in the year. So this June summit was really tough for us. I'm happy actually that we managed to get it out at the time. So we would have liked to have more, let's say, conversations with you beforehand. But I'm happy that we at least had some of it on process and procedure. But the question on how to feed into the draft is difficult to answer, because it will be up to future G7 presidencies to decide on how they want to run this. So what I said before, like in the first meeting of the year, you decide on procedure and how do you want to do this, and who do you engage at which time and why and how. But the indicators are also fixed. So my recommendation would be, if you want to work on this, keep your eyes peeled, obviously, for what the thematic or sectoral report will be when they come out. But you already know now that in 2025, there will be another comprehensive report. And you will also know what the commitments are that will be monitored, because they will be the same as this year, minus those that have been sunsetted, and in addition, those that we will include this year. So you can already prepare for those, because you know what they are. So, and then maybe proactively make an offer to engage with colleagues on these points. But the question would be, where do you have inroads? So the indicators that come from databases are available databases. So, I mean, they're dictated by the numbers. And maybe then the main contribution would be on anything that is self-reporting. So where we have the narrative reporting by states. If you have knowledge of, let's say, additional activities or issues that you might have encountered, I think that is probably where you could where would be the natural point to link up for civil society. Because I think on databases, it's difficult because you end up in a methodological debate on the quality of the database. I'm not sure if that is politically, let's say, the most fruitful approach. So yeah, I think if I would be trying to contribute to this from a civil society perspective, apart from commenting on the results and progress, this is how I would go about it.
Okay, thank you. I think the question of the role of civil society, we will come back to that question again. For now, thank you a lot. I would like to succeed to Param Rajput and our second input.
Greetings from India. And first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Timo for giving an excellent presentation on the procedure, methodology, and also, certain questions that have been asked. the answer to them clearly is that the process is pretty complex and not easy to, get into it. Anyhow, I really feel it a matter of privilege and honor to represent W7 as an advisor in this C7 prestigious event to share my reflections on G7 Accountability Report 2022. Thank you, Sophie, for inviting me. But I do want to acknowledge and thank W7 for two reasons. One, having us on board as advisors. We are there from probably 24 countries, 60 in number. And secondly, for asking me to speak today and represent W7. Frankly speaking, and I was actually wondering why we from the countries other than G7 have been asked to, speak. Why not the G7 representatives themselves? But as I did go through the report and the external commitments of G7, I felt that we too are stakeholders, and the choice on me could also be because I co-chaired the accountability WG, working group. So thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Laura, for asking me to speak today. And let me begin by saying that accountability and transparencies are key to good governance and legitimacy. I want to underline the word legitimacy. The governance structures may be local or global, may be formal or informal like the G7, and the commitments would remain mere intentions if there are no effective mechanisms for monitoring and reporting on their implementation to the stakeholders. G7 countries need to be complemented for establishing the accountability mechanism through the accountability working group, as was shown a couple of minutes ago on the slides, that comes out with a comprehensive report every 3 years. Interestingly, it was during 2000 summit in Germany that the idea of having a system of accountability was floated. And here we are having the 5th report being released in Germany itself. The report, as you see, is a voluminous report with baseline indicators, data sources. It covers commitments made during the last 6 years and focuses on development and development-related actions. There is both external and internal accountability, and more on external, because I see a lot of it is, G7 countries seem to be committed to development and funding the countries beyond their boundaries, and as much part of their commitment to Transformative Agenda 2030. I'm sure some of you must have had a chance to look at the present report. It focuses on 10 thematic issues and 50 commitments, and a few case studies attached to each chapter. The issues covered are aid and aid effectiveness with 3 commitments, economic development with 5 commitments, health with 12 commitments, food and security 1 commitment, education 3, equality 4, governance 10, peace and security 3, environment and energy 7, and the last thematic issue is human mobility, which has 2 commitments. Now, the listing of issues and commitments is impressive, and I therefore comment on before I comment on the report from gender perspective, since the previous speaker was talking and drawing attention to the procedural, rigidities, I would call that, I would like to draw the attention to the observation of Dr. Rogers, who himself had been a part of G7 and G77. And his observations are very valid even today. And he observes on both accounts, that is external accountability as well as internal accountability, the actual performance is less than perfect. I would like to underline that actual performance is less than perfect. Outside stakeholders do not always have a chance to effectively verify the G7 actions against its words because some commitments lack clarity and reporting and is not focused as it could be. The process inside G7 does not make it easy, underlines Dr. Roger, for leaders to use accountability reports as a basis for their decisive decisions. When leaders design their new policies, they never use them. So as a result, this feedback loop into the internal accountability does not work, and the opportunities to use implementation experience for better policy making is lost. I think this is something which needs to be reflected upon the G7. Now, it is significant observation, and I personally feel it must be taken into account. But before commenting on the 10 thematic issues and commitments from gender perspective, I would like to say at the outset that all of you will agree with me, and more so when you have a number of countries in G7 which are following now the feminist foreign policy, that the issues have all the issues have gender implications. I want to emphasize all the issues have gender implications, and that development and development-related commitments, be it any issue, cannot use a tinted glass or, for that matter, gender-neutral language, which, as you know, is always gender-blind. We strongly, we struggled hard for 2 years. I'm sure some of you must be part of that process prior to the adoption of the transformative agenda to see to it that gender was considered as a cross-cutting theme in all the goals, in addition to standalone goal on gender equality and empowerment of women. So to me, all the thematic issues and commitments must reflect that too. But I'm constrained to say that with the exception of thematic issue on education and equality and a few other commitments in like peace and security, reference to gender and gender equality, women and girls is marginal, nay, it is casual. And you find, staggered references, be it aid effectiveness, commitments to trade and infrastructure, or for that matter, the supply chains under economic development. And we all know how the disruption of supply chain affected women workers and the issues of livelihood during the pandemic. In the economic issues, in the trade commitment, while there are no indicators, there are no indicators at all that refer to gender, but it was heartening to see trade commitment. Canada is one country that promotes inclusive trade and gender equality in its trade and development approach in line with the feminist international assistance policy goal. And again, in commitment 5, with regard to trade and infrastructure in Africa, Canada mentioned that its sports making trade work for women in Eastern Africa project, and they promote economic employment of female traders and reduce sexual and gender-based violence. Health is an issue which all of you will agree with me has more gender implication. Now, this you see again when you look at the indicators that doesn't reflect. Health includes universal health coverage, investment in health in caregivers, it talks about, leadership of women in minorities in healthcare sector. But only, commitment 16 talks about prevention of child deaths and improving maternal health. And no other indicator, has, a gender content in that. Now, the fourth issue, which is so critical, food and nutrition. And as the previous speaker was saying, they're going to include it again. There is, we know that when you look at feminization of poverty, food and nutrition are critical. But only commitment 21 in this issue, is where it is said that in the resources are committed to agriculture with a gender focus, right? And it has decreased, I'm underlining the word, it has decreased from 71.9% 27 to 56.3% in 29. Though projects with gender as the main objective, it has increased from only 3.4% to 4.8%. So this issue again has no. And again, if you refer to the issues on education and equality, I'll revert to later. But if you look at issue of governance, there is no indicator at all. There is no reference to gender at all in the whole thematic issue and the commitment. Similarly, on environment and energy, we all know that we talk about how women are affected by the climate crisis. We talk about role of women in mitigating the crisis, their role in conservation of biodiversity, adaptation strategies, and climate change. WIDO itself is working on climate finance for a long time, but it is only commitment 48 on climate finance, where it is mentioned, which was made in 2017, that talks about development of a gender responsive approach to climate change, financing investment policy so that women and girls can participate in green economy. But no score is given on this because it is a new commitment. However, one finds is that in the report, there is, there are countries like Canada, Germany, UK, USA, which are putting in a lot of funds for this, women's role in green economy. And the other issue that is dealt with is that relates to peace and security. And there, commitment 40 talks about women in peace and security. And in that, there is reference to Sustainable Development Goal 5 as well as 16. And on this, based on the indicators, there are 2 indicators. And on the basis of those indicators, the score is good. And the indicators are clearly with regard to, that the G7 countries would help establish national action plans on women, peace and security, and also financing and providing technical assistance on policy support by G7 countries to the partner countries in this. So under G7 support and development, the data is given that a variety of countries have now come up with the national action plans for that matter. UN probably reports that 98 countries have national action plans. Be that as it may, again, you see this issue of, human mobility, the 10th thematic issues on human mobility. Now, human mobility talks about refugees and migrants. Now, it's very interesting that this again has no indicator, whereas we know that 50% of world's, refugees are women, 49% population of migrants is that of women. And we know that how, because of pandemic, or as a result of conflict situation, or in search of employment, there are more women who are refugees and all that. The only good thing that this report has, that it gives a case study in the sense the work that the German Action Network is doing, right, as a part of their helping the displaced women, for that matter, from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Ukraine, and many other countries. And they are also now part of global compact on that. But otherwise, the two, no indicator talks about it, so there's no point of talking. Now, let me talk about the 2 thematic. Now, I have, out of the 10, I have talked about 8 issues, which give a kind of only a cursory reference or even no reference at all to gender perspective of the issues. But the 2 issues, thematic issues that talk about gender, one is education and the other is the equality. Now, commitments, on education, I must say, they are in the background of how COVID impacted the inclusive and equitable education as in Sustainable Development Goal. Commitment 22 talks about quality education for women and girls, and SDGs 1, 4, 5. Right? 1, of course, is on poverty, 4 is on education, 5 is on gender equality, and the score is satisfactory. And the indicators are the G7 ODA to education with the aim of achieving gender equality, gross and national enrollment, as well as completion ratios by level of education. And there, that they ask for sex disaggregated data. So G7's bilateral ODA to education has been on the increase. This is a very happy sign. And also commitment 24 of this theme, it talks about girls' education. And this is a new commitment that has been made in the 2021 summit. And again, it is in the background of how COVID exacerbated inequalities and worst educational crisis for children in the world. It is noted that girls are 2.5 times more likely to be out of school. At the secondary level, 90% of them are out of school. And to counter this, the G7 committed to 2 new targets on girls' education. That is 40 million more girls in education by 2026 in low and lower middle income countries, 20 million more girls, reading by age 10 or by the end of primary school by 2026. So G7 has committed to monitoring the female enrollment at the primary and secondary level. And the indicators also, make a clear reference, but there is no score because this is, a new commitment. Now, most important to us, of course, is again, it comes, that you put gender as separate this thing. So is the equality theme. And a few observations may be in place before I talk about the other issues. One is that the theme refers to inequality, discrimination related to gender identities and sexual orientation that are harming women and girls and LGBTQI. Now, this is the first where this kind of a reference comes. Second, gender inequalities in economic sphere, health, education, paid, unpaid care work, gender-based violence, lack of access to business and finance services, less representation of women in parliaments and managerial positions. It also talks about the adverse impact of COVID and the greater impact of that on LGBTQI. That is that then in 2018, G7 countries, also it is important to note, convened a gender equality advisory council, what we call it as GAC, of independent experts with the mandate to support G7 in integrating gender issues in theme. It provides also annual reports. Now, under the equality theme, while these points have been mentioned, but there are 4 critical commitments that have been made. One is regarding SRHR, that is sexual reproductive health and rights. Second is technical and vocational education. Third is women's economic empowerment. And fourth is advancing gender equality through non-discriminatory legislations. Now, commitment 25, which is on SRHR, right? That is ending child early and forced marriages. It refers to Sustainable Development Goal 3 as well as 5. And I must underline, it has 5 indicators, but must underline that the score is below expectation. And second, I want to say is that G7 ODA spending, associated RM and CH has increased, of course, and individual G7 countries are also funding programs to, ending female genital mutilation and early child marriages, etc., etc. Also on ending violence against women. And G7 countries have also sponsored resolutions in the General Assembly. Now, another under equality theme is a commitment that is 26, which talks about technical and vocational, training. Again, it refers to sustainable goals 4 and 5. Under here, the only one indicator is there, and the score is good. Now, G7 countries are providing education instruction for TVET, as it's called. Then the third commitment under equality is the commitment 27, which relates to women's economic empowerment, and again a broad-based commitment. It is to overcome discrimination, sexual harassment, violence against women, other cultural, socio, and legal barriers to women's economic empowerment. The SDGs referred at 5, 10, and 16, and there are two indicators here. The two indicators are economic growth initiative focused on, achieving gender equality and empowerment, and G7 ODA on elimination of violence against women. The next is that the score, of course, is satisfaction over here, but the G7 ODA spending on projects with gender equality objective has increased between 2015 to 2020 from 36.1%, to $40.2 billion, which is 36.1% of the total bilateral ODA. Now, commitment 28, which is another, and that is advancing gender equality, which is the last commitment on the gender equality, and that is advancing gender equality through non-discriminatory legislation. Again, this is a new commitment. SDGs 5, 10, 16 are referred, and there are 44 indicators on this, but there is no score, because it is a new commitment. And G7 has made contribution, of course, to UN Women to promote laws and policy for gender equality, as is clear from the UN Women reports. G7 also, have supported partner countries on different stages of policy cycle to design and operationalize policies. Germany, for instance, has provided support to legislative framework in 50 countries. France has provided support similarly to 14 countries. UK, co-led the negotiations, and that's a very important ILO convention, and that convention is on ending violence and harassment in the world of work. And between 2019 and 2022, US has also assisted 22 countries with proposals, drafts, etc., etc. And there is a case study also from France, how they have supported the feminist organizations, particularly after the Generational Equality Forum. Now, I think I've taken enough of time, but few points that I would like to make and then conclude. And that is, having shared my comments and details, I'm back to accountability. And that is, there are some general comments that I would like to make, and they are also, comments that my friend shared with me during the discussion. I would like to make particularly mention to my friend Laura. And I mentioned about the scores. Now, it is not transparent as to how these scores are calculated. It just says these are the indicators and this is the score. There is no details are available at all that how these scores are calculated. Second, the report is very detailed and in most places only lists positive examples. In fact, the whole report has only positive examples, and nowhere it goes deeper into what is lacking and how to go about it. For example, I may just refer to commitment 25 on SRHR. The score mentioned, some score is mentioned over there, but still it lists, score is low. And still it lists, says not satisfactory, still it lists that G7 states in this regard are doing this, are doing this. So one wonders about this contradiction when the score is low, but still, there is a listing of things that the G7 countries are doing. That really, defeats the purpose of monitoring the implementation of the commitments through accountability report. Furthermore, the dashboard is also provided to us. Now, this dashboard gives us the gender gap, but is based on exclusive binary definition of gender and makes it impossible to monitor progress on LGBTQI rights. We found the reference in the thematic issue, but nowhere else, we find that how it is proposed to be supported. So it is very difficult to monitor the progress on their rights in the text, because it is just a lip service to me for that matter. The accountability report, frankly speaking, suffers from what I would call as a pure quantitative approach. Our previous speaker was also saying that it is quantitative, and it is neither an evaluation on G7 legislation, nor does it report on implementation of GAC and W7 recommendation. G7 commitments made, as we have been advocating and demanding, is that there should be an implementation plan and to be acted upon. So it is high time. Of course, there's no denying the point that commitments are critical. Commitments can become catalytic and they are important. But it is high time that G7 visits the accountability framework, both external and internal, and make it more meaningful exercise and to see that the feedback loop guides the policy formulation and implementation, not to say the least, from gender perspective and responsiveness. Of course, you are saying that these are already decided. Well, past is past. Can the beginning be made from 2022? And if it is not done now, at least from 2023, that when further, commitments are made, they are made from gender perspective and gender responsiveness and on the basis of gender disaggregated data. There's no doubt about it that then shall the accountability report more robust and exemplary and a meaningful exercise. Nonetheless, the G7, again, I would say, needs to be complimented for having developed this mechanism. And I'm sure as the years go by, the accountability report henceforth will be a gender responsive and from gender perspective for that matter. I thank you, C7 again. I thank you, W7 again, for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on the issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pam, for this comprehensive analysis. Yeah, we're a little bit behind schedule. Nevertheless, I would like to take the time for questions directly to Pam on her input. I see Timo wants to say something, please.
Yeah, I don't know if this is an English expression, but duck away, which means dodge the points you made, Pam. Thank you very much. I mean, your presentation was very comprehensive, and I don't want to go into all of it, obviously. And a lot of things I think are not, let's say in the scope of the mandate of the accountability working group, but also more political questions. But just a few things, especially on the last ones that you had, because I think they highlight some gaps maybe in what I presented earlier. So you mentioned the scoring. I think this could be of interest, like why do we score and how do we score? Again, the easy and the not so easy way. So the easy way is if we do have quantitative commitments and quantitative indicators and the underlying data, then it's a percentile grading. So if we are above 80%, then it's excellent, and then it goes down with the 20% steps according to our 5 scale kind of measurement. If you do this in academia, I'm pretty sure you will end up in trouble, because these percentiles are not always scales. So that like 1 percentile of better result in a database does not always mean it's the same percent than the ones that are below. Like, it's a bit complicated. Just for those that are more into data, we can discuss this. But that is one issue there, but I think it's minor. So that is relatively clean. And then where we do not have quantitative data or quantitative reporting, so where the reporting is more narrative self-reporting, obviously this gets much trickier. So we need to come to an agreement in the accountability working group on how we see ourselves in terms of how have we performed against the commitment. And those debates are not easy. I mean, we were, I think, never wildly in different camps. Let's say one or two members saying it's excellent, the other ones are saying we're completely off track. That did not happen, but obviously it's a question of one level up or one level down, which in a 5-step scale is already quite a lot. So these debates we do have, and we do have rather intensively. And they go both ways. Sometimes we take the better option. Sometimes we take the worse option because we convince each other of one or the other. So that is how the scoring happens. It's not a scientific process. It's an evaluation process and a process of self-evaluation. So complicated for sure. For anybody that's interested into the details, and I mean your presentation has shown this super clearly. I think you really need to look beyond the scoring and into the text. I personally not a huge fan of the scoring exercise because I think it takes away from the content. But I understand the political importance to nail this into 1 or 2 words, like how have we done? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Sure. But I think the content and the wealth of information in the report goes much further than that. You also pointed out that we only have positive examples. That is possible. I wouldn't need to go through the whole thing, but it seems plausible to me. And I do understand the criticism in there that we should also have like negative examples in there. But the thing is probably if we haven't done anything, then it's difficult to report on it. So to say, like you cannot say we have not done action A or action B, which there will be gaps in the reporting that will highlight that not every G7 country or every G7 member has contributed equally to goal A or B. So, but as there's rarely defined actions that you need to take, it's a bit difficult to report on something that doesn't exist. So I think it rings with me. If you look at academic writing and publication in papers in academic journals, it is the same idea that it's very difficult to report something that didn't happen, like unless it was supposed to exist. So I don't know if that makes sense or is this too esoterical right now. But you need a counterfactual basically against which to report, and if you don't have it, you can't report. So, but it's a good point to think about and maybe include. I know my colleagues from IDOS are also here to include this into our collection that we will hand over to the next presidency. Like we have a little compendium that we're going to give them. So this is an idea that we could include there as well. I think it's a good idea. Binary gender categories, depends usually on the commitment language, so or on the data availability on the database that are there. But I'm sure there's a lot of support for going beyond that where we can on the technical level and also on the political level. But I cannot commit to the leaders now. I wouldn't want to do that. But obviously, there's also different positions there. But I'm pretty sure that that's also growing support, as there is for feminist foreign and development policy. So I think this goes into the same direction. Last point because you also had it in your summary on GEAC and let's say their recommendations. There is a parallel process now to the accountability working group process, which is based on the invitation by the G7 leaders from last year to GEAC to have some form of reporting process. So maybe this would be interesting for another session for you and colleagues to look a bit closer into this. I don't know where this currently stands because I've been with my head in accountability working group business. But the main idea is that in order not to have two reports on the same subjects, that this reporting will focus more on G7 internal processes, let's say domestic commitments, things you need to do at home, while this accountability working group report focuses on everything that is development and development related. So it's like an outward looking document. So this is, let's say, in very rough terms, the separation between these two processes, and the other one is brand new and still in the making. But I think a lot of, or some of you at least, are also engaged with that process. So maybe that is interesting also to look at. But that is something that we do have on the radar, but that is dealt with in another process. So yeah, just some extra points to maybe respond to a few points. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I also have one last question. Timo talked about, also connecting to the previous question, the role of civil society. And I wanted to give that back to you, Pam. Where do you see, potential for engaging civil society in the reporting process or accountability at all in G7 beyond the present scope?
Yeah, I'm all for the engagement of civil society. Absolutely. Civil society, the voices and the voices of gender groups, they're very, very important. And in that context also, you see, when I talk about gender, I think GAC has a very critical role to play, right? And we interact with GAC. That can also be a mechanism for the civil society, right, to be more. But I think that this alternate thing that report that has just been mentioned, reporting process that is in the offing, I think that would really offer the civil society from within the G7 countries, right? It may not be for countries like us, but it will be for the civil society groups to influence that reporting, see that the issues are first there and then reporting is there on those very issues. The role of civil society is critical in every country, in every groupings, whether it is G7 or it is G20. They are the true stakeholders, I would call.
Thank you. Okay, I think also due to time, we are beyond our schedule. I'd like to close the session. I thank you very much, first of all, Pam and Timo, for your time and effort you put into your very comprehensive presentations, and everyone for participating and discussing with us. As Civil 7, we are going to host a few other online events till end of the year. And if you're not already in the newsletter, I invite you to sign up for the C7 newsletter. Then you will be informed about our other online sessions. And thank you again.
And thank you once again, C7 and W7, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Perfect.
Same from my side, and underlining, yes, indeed, you are the true stakeholders of this process. I have no doubt about it. Although I think it says something else in the terms, but the reality is that, absolutely. So thanks for
thank you, sir.
The interest.